I'm Sharon Squassani. I direct the Proliferation Prevention Program here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And it's my pleasure to welcome you this morning. I know this is the Friday before Labor Day, so I really appreciate your time and attention. Just a few administrative remarks. We do have a system of plan of action, whatever you might call it, in case there's an emergency. So Yukari Sekaguchi in the back, if there's a problem, turn around and she's raising her hand, we'll follow her. Please turn your cell phones off. It creates a problem with our sound system, and it can also be distracting to our speakers. I am going to introduce our panelists first before we launch into the substance of our discussion today. Everybody knows we're not talking about Iran, right? It's not Iran this morning. It's kind of a throwback to the past, here to talk about non-strategic nuclear weapons and the U.S. Russian relationship. I am joined today by three experts who all participated in both of the dialogues that we conducted with the Russians, first in October and then more recently in June. On my immediate right is Andy Cutchins, who is a Director and Senior Fellow of the Russia and Eurasia Program, and a well-known author, and I think we didn't overlap at the Carnegie Endowment. I think you were there before me, and in Moscow also. Next to Andy is Ambassador Steve Pfeiffer, who directs the Arms Control and Non-Proliferation Initiative, and Steve is a former ambassador to Ukraine, so all of his experiences, both in the Ukraine and elsewhere during his foreign service career, have been invaluable to our discussions. And then next to Steve is Guy Roberts, who is a former Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Weapons of Mass Destruction Policy at NATO. And Guy and I go back a long time in the arms control. Not that long? Okay. In the non-proliferation and arms control scene. I am going to try to limit my remarks. I'm just going to set up, how we did this dialogue, what were some of the conclusions, and then we're going to give each of our panelists a couple minutes to give their impressions, or, I asked them, tell me what you thought about this dialogue, what was different, how it changed from October to June, and also what they thought were some of the most interesting outcomes from it. But I think I need to set up this whole thing for you. So I didn't print out reports in deference to the environment, but those are the links, and they're all on our website. There's a long report from the first workshop in October, and then an even longer report from the second workshop in June. This project was sponsored by, technically by the Navy. It was the Project on Advanced System Concepts for Combating WMD. They sponsor a lot of strategic dialogues. And here's the important part. The grant was awarded for the fiscal year 2014, right? So in about October 2013, things were a lot different than they are today in terms of the U.S. Russian relationship. The objectives initially were to explore really verification modalities. If you were actually able to sit down officially with the Russians and negotiate an arms control agreement to limit non-strategic nuclear weapons, how would you go, how would you think about it? What verification would you think about? Of course, this changed over time, and initially, the first agreement was to sort of set the groundwork, and the second meeting was supposed to look at very hardcore issues of an agreement. Instead, what we had was Russia's annexation of Crimea, the U.S. State Department's verification and compliance report were the first official allegations of Russian violations of the INF Treaty. We had sanctions, as you well know. And all the while, New START implementation was, moving along, maybe a little bit more slowly. And so because of this, because of these increased tensions, what we decided to do in October was, okay, let's focus on confidence-building measures. What can we do in terms of political and technical confidence-building measures? And so in October, we met in Vienna. We had 7 Russians, 10 Americans, and 1 European. We quickly realized that, we do need some vital European voices in this dialogue. We didn't do much better. We had 2 Europeans in June, but I think if we move forward in this process, we'll include several more. And so in the October workshop, we had 3 different sessions. We looked at political factors, technical confidence-building measures, and then political confidence-building measures. And we actually spent an afternoon where we broke up into working groups to come up with specific recommendations. I don't want to overwhelm you with all the details. They are there in the report. I'm going to give you some examples. But in October, the themes were, we sort of rallied around a few themes. One is that, arms control is never easy, and in times of crisis, it's not easy. But it is still an important venue, if you can use it, to build transparency and trust. In October, all of the participants said, well, obviously, official limits on non-strategic nuclear weapons are off the table. Interestingly enough, in October, our Russian counterparts were quite clear. They said, look, Crimea is about European security. It's not about global security. This is not a new Cold War. Definitely not a new Cold War. In June, that tone had changed quite considerably, and that really affected the kinds of things that we talked about. We spent a good deal of time. We had some representation from U.S. national labs, and so we talked very specifically about verification technology, and that was one of the areas that we believe could be fruitful, even if we're just looking at longer-term technology developments. And we also talked about confidence-building measures in terms of lab-to-lab cooperation, limited data exchanges, and then, of course, the kind of existing venues of cooperation like the Proliferation Security Initiative, UN Security Council Resolution 1540. So we really kind of cast our net widely. The next few slides are a long list of things that we talked about, and I welcome, in the Q&A session if you want to ask specific questions about them. Obviously, the Russians are really big on historical data exchanges on the presidential nuclear initiatives. These go back to the 1990s. So the idea is if you have a good baseline of what nuclear weapons, non-strategic nuclear weapons are out there, then you can move forward from that baseline. They were a little, as were we, I guess, a little more squeamish on sort of more current data exchanges. In October, we said, we really cannot reaffirm what we call the NATO 3 no's, which is that we have no intention, no plan, and no reason to deploy nuclear weapons on the territories of new member states of NATO. And we could not commit to no modernization. And so these were topics that we discussed at length, both in October and a little bit in June. On the technical confidence-building measure area, we had the basic assumption that multilateral confidence-building measures were the hardest, bilateral at the moment were probably desirable but not so easy to accomplish, and that unilateral measures might be okay. All right, so that's a very narrow avenue for doing things. But we still talked about, possibly having expert visits to former storage sites in Europe and thinking about some of the things that we had done in the past with the Russians, for example, the trilateral initiative between Russia, U.S., and IAEA on fissile material. In the longer term, the idea was to focus on cross-cutting technologies, things like information, transmission security, data storage, information barriers, and kind of soften the focus away from verification and more on sort of monitoring. There are a lot of things that we have done in the fissile material area that we might think about in the future. And then we had a third working group. It was kind of funny. It's like, well, you know, we talked about political and technical confidence building measures. Let's think about tangential opportunities. And that group kind of just brainstormed, came to the conclusion that, wow, we really need a broader dialogue about European security, but it's probably not possible right now. But I think everybody agreed that we really need to create some stability and transparency. And in our June workshop, that was a heavy focus, I would say. All right, so I really am going to try and breeze through the next few slides. In our second workshop, what we tried to do was say, okay, we had a menu of ideas, let's drill down on that. And so I asked each participant to come up with 2 specific ideas. I said, put some meat on those bones, we'll circulate it. We came up with what I call an ideas paper. That is on our website, and it's, you know, in this package for the second workshop. And in those ideas, I asked folks to focus on military doctrine, transparency, technology development, and then safety and security of nuclear weapons. And this was kind of the surprise topic, I think, for our second workshop, which is it's kind of counterintuitive, right? If you're having if your relations are not the best at the moment, can you really talk about sensitive topics like the safety and security of nuclear weapons? And what we decided was, you know, it's worth a shot, right? We have a lot of focus on nuclear security these days, and there have been exercises and cooperation with the Russians in the past in some limited ways. And so we have a menu of potential cooperative actions we could take there. All right, so this ideas paper, you can see we had a lot of ideas on the transparency end of it. It was pretty evenly divided, I would say. I can't really go through all of this here, A, because I think it would bore you, and B, there's a lot of a lot of language on those slides. But I think suffice it to say that, and I know Steve is going to talk specifically about military doctrine, there are a lot of topics we need to talk with the Russians about, and specifically given some of the statements by Putin and other, lower officials, we need to clarify some topics with them, and they feel the same way. For example, on ballistic missile defenses. So transparency, we had a lot of, and I apologize that this is so dark. It didn't look this way on my computer. Lot of different ideas for kinds of information we might exchange with the Russians. And one particular topic that we talked about at length in June was the alleged INF violations. And I think we're going to discuss a few ideas that we had for being a little more transparent about those alleged violations on both sides. Technology development, lots of stuff emanating from our labs. I think in the future, if we did this again, I would get some Russian laboratory experts as well. There's a lot of work to be done on authentication of information. There was a lot of interest in remote monitoring techniques. And fundamentally, for non-strategic nuclear weapons, you have a lot of definitional issues which have an impact on the kinds of verification that you can explore. keep going through this. On safety and security of nuclear weapons, a few of the ideas that came out were to do a joint threat assessment of the risks of terrorists penetrating a storage site. You could also flip that around and do a joint assessment of site security improvements. You could do some exercises that build on things that were done with the NATO Russia Council on recovery. You know, how would you recover a nuclear weapon that was stolen? Those kinds of things. Okay. So that's the sort of setup for the workshop, and now I'm just going to highlight a few of the themes that we explored. 2 more slides. Fundamentally, the U.S. and Russia need a new basis for transparency. The old bases don't work, and that is, in the 1990s, Russia was looking forward to somewhat to integration into Western institutions, and transparency was seen as the price for that. That is no longer viewed in that way. We talked a lot about nuclear messaging and how we have new generations of officials and how we might need to tweak that. We don't know how well that works anymore. On the uses of transparency, we suggested that the Russians need to clarify the status and the relevance of de-escalation concepts. In other words, you know, are they really contemplating the use of non-strategic nuclear weapons to avoid a bigger war or a conventional incursion? And we talked specifically about some Russian military exercises that would give the appearance of that kind of alarming doctrine. And on the Russian side, they said the U.S. needs to clarify what did Ash Carter actually mean in terms of I think it was Ash Carter, right? In terms of countervailing measures in response to INF. There are some, you know, there were some surprising misunderstandings given sort of the level and expertise in the room, at least surprising to me. I think we agreed we need a new political umbrella and that we need some short-term actions urgently. Fundamentally, I think we agreed that U.S., NATO, and Russian military officers and policymakers need to meet to review implementation of current agreements designed to avoid misunderstandings. And so one of these is the Incidents at Sea Agreement. In the last few years, there have been, I think, over 40 incidents between military forces, and I think right after our meeting, the American, I'm trying to remember, admiral and a Russian admiral met in Naples to actually discuss some of that. But we believe that it needs to be even broader. We suggested that we should expand the Vienna documents confidence-building measures to include exchanges of information regarding non-strategic nuclear weapons, high-precision conventional weapons, and air and missile defenses. And in the short term, we had a list of actions that we thought were urgently needed. So we need more information. If it's, you know, we were told, well, it exists on a classified basis, but we said, you know, Russian experts, you really need to publish articles on this concept of de-escalation, and whether it's, we were told that it's not a part of official Russian doctrine. Well, you know, we'd like more confirmation of that. One of our participants recommended that the U.S. government should consider some transparency measures to demonstrate that the Mk-41 missile launcher for Aegis Ashore cannot contain or launch offensive surface-to-surface missiles. This is one of the allegations that the Russians have made. We recommended that NATO and Russian governments should reconvene joint activities regarding the safety and security of nuclear weapons or exchange such collaboration to include an exchange of best practices. Sorry, that wording is a little off. And then finally, we said, well, maybe the Special Verification Commission under the INF Treaty should be reconvened to talk about the allegations of violations on both sides. In the longer term, we think it would be useful to reconvene activities previously conducted by the NATO Russia Council, including military-to-military exchanges on avoiding misunderstandings. We think we should resume U.S. Russian activities related to developing better technologies for verification. And finally, we think there needs to be a new review of classification issues regarding nuclear warheads. So those are the big sort of items from these two dialogues. And I'm going to stop there and welcome my colleagues. I think we're all just going to sit at this table. We can do it however you'd like, to provide their insights on these two rounds of talks. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you, Sharon, for inviting me to speak today and also to participate in the two meetings that were held over the past year, October in Vienna and in June here in Washington. I'm going to make some brief comments about why I think this exercise was so important and important that we continue, and then some remarks about the domestic political context in Russia, which Sharon asked me to speak about. So there is a feeling for me, and I think for all of us, of sort of deja vu all over again in having these discussions. As a young, aspiring Sovietologist in the 1980s, I cut my teeth on meetings and discussions like this, and through the 1990s, dealing with the nuclear legacy of the Cold War was a very relevant and even urgent topic, I think, for a lot of us. And then something seemed to happen. The topics of nuclear security, non-proliferation, arms control, etc., seem to some extent to lose their urgency, I think, at least from my perspective, and their relevance. And I was thinking about this and talking about it yesterday at lunch with Sharon. And what happened? Well, okay, I think the Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration, had something to do with this as they came to power in 2001 with a very different perspective on the value of, I think, what we refer to as traditional arms control agreements, negotiations, etc. Whether one agrees or does not agree, there was the withdrawal from the ABM Treaty. There was the so-called Moscow Treaty, which was basically a bone thrown to the Russians because the Russians wanted a piece of paper in May of 2002, and so they got about three and a half pages of paper in the Moscow Treaty. Two. Thank you for the correction, Steve.
It's longer in Russian, but in English.
Russian is a complicated language, so it might be three. And the message was, the Cold War is over. We are no longer enemies. Despite the fact that most of the weapons from the Cold War remained where they were, remained on hair trigger alert in many of the same places as to where they were. And then what happened? Well, 9/11, I think this had something to do with how nuclear security to some extent went out of vogue. Although personally, my first thought in watching the second airplane go into a World Trade Center building was, as horrific as this is, imagine what a disaster this would be if this involved a weapon of mass destruction, a nuclear weapon. But I think something deeper was at work. It seems to me like we, and I mean to some extent the policy community in the United States, that we went on a strategic holiday. And we seem to forget to some extent the nature of the existential threat that these weapons present to ourselves and to our planet. Yeah, we had the unipolar moment. Yeah, we had the Eurasian land wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Yes, much more discussion about global warming or global climate change, global jihad, the global financial crisis. And Mr. Obama did become infatuated with the idea of global zero momentarily, until I think he and his administration realized, presumably, that virtually all of the other nuclear states, existing and aspiring, had no interest in global zero because nuclear weapons were their asymmetric strategic equalizer in trying to prevent making the world safe for American conventional weapons dominance. But thanks to Vladimir Putin, to some extent, it looks like the strategic holiday is over. The ongoing war in Ukraine, as Sharon alluded to, reminds us that we never did successfully resolve the challenge of building a new European security system in the quarter century since the end of the Cold War. And thousands of the strategic and non-strategic nuclear weapons that we used to agonize over, they're still around. And Putin loves to remind us that they're still around. And that, yes, Russia could incinerate Europe and the United States on a moment's notice if they so chose. Now, Mr. Yeltsin used to make bombastic, pun intended, remarks like that, but we would kind of toss it off and say, oh, that's old Boris, he's had a few vodkas and, you know, he's not really serious. But when Vladimir says this, you know, we kind of look at each other and this dude, no, he's not really serious, is he? You know, I remember when Mr. Obama said in March of 2014 in Brussels, just after the annexation of Crimea, and he was making a cutting remark about Russia, really. And he said, Russia is just a regional power. What keeps me up at night is the thought of a nuclear weapon going off in New York. And honestly, the first thought that came to my mind was, don't give him any ideas. Come on. Now, seriously, here we find ourselves in a situation today where Russian military forces are violating airspace, sea space of NATO countries at record rates. NATO is preparing to move more forces closer to the Russian border. Military exercises on both sides are beefed up, and we are coming into much closer proximity to each other, as we often did during the Cold War. And the term the new Cold War is already a cliche, whether you agree or not. Now, what happened? Well, that's not the topic for today. I will explain that in my next book. But the point I want to emphasize is that the strategic holiday is over. The topic of nuclear weapons, strategic and non-strategic, and there are a lot smarter people at the table than in this room about the technical issues involved, is indeed relevant and perhaps urgent. And that is why these two meetings that Sharon organized were so important. Conversations that used to happen so frequently with Russians 20 to 30 years ago, maybe even more years ago, we have to some extent forgotten how to have. And worryingly to me, the cadres trained to have useful conversations on this topic have diminished. 20 or 30 years ago, I was one of the youngest guys in the room in such a conversation. Today, I still remain one of the younger people in the room in a conversation about this. And guess what? I'm not so young. And so I think this issue of training a next generation of experts to understand the technical, the political, the historical details and facts about these weapons, which still exist and present tremendous dangers, is very important. I suspect, and in fact I know, that the generational dilemma is quite a bit worse on the Russian side. So let me just conclude by making a few comments about the Russian political context that Sharon asked me to speak about. I could provide two words: not good. Okay, I'll provide a little bit more than that. Recall in the spring and summer of 2013, when newly re-elected President Obama, he wanted to pursue a reset two, if you will, with the Russians. And the focus of that was on arms control, hopefully another round of strategic offensive reductions, and yes, possibly a broader discussion of strategic stability, including the roles of missile defense, precision-guided munitions, and space-based weapons, etc. Now, yes, Mr. Snowden, remember him, he did complicate things in the summer of 2013, but basically the reason why that discussion ended, in my view, was that the Russians were not interested at the time in pursuing the discussion, or at least not in the terms in which the Obama administration wanted to. And as you recall, the summit meeting that Mr. Putin and Mr. Obama were to have on the sidelines of the G20 meeting, or actually in Moscow, right after the G20 meeting in St. Petersburg, that was canceled. Now, over the course of the last 20 years, nuclear weapons have come to assume a much larger role in the overall strategic posture for Moscow, and I think the reverse is true for us. And so one problem I think we face in a larger, in a sort of a general way, is there is kind of a strategic mismatch to a greater extent today than that which existed during the Cold War period, especially the latter Cold War period. But secondly, and over the last 15 years, whatever trust Vladimir Putin had towards the United States, particularly the United States, has evaporated. And even worse, his whole domestic political consolidation is much more dependent upon anti-Americanism. It is the principal prop, I think, in his political legitimacy, authority-building strategy with the Russian public. And so we've just heard this over the past several years, this growing chorus of, you know, we are the enemy. We seek to weaken Russia. Come on, let's be serious. The CIA, the NSA, the State Department, all of the NGOs that we support, we can't hold a candle to the Russians themselves when it comes to the task of weakening Russia. Sorry, but just had to say that. But I think the point for Mr. Putin is that for most of the time that he has been leader, de facto and or de jure of Russia, it has been economic growth and prosperity which has been the principal backbone of his political popularity. That has ebbed away over the last few years, and it is now this anti-Americanism, anti-Westernism, which is so much more important for the domestic political consolidation. Now, that's an obstacle. It's not an insuperable obstacle. We have had important instances of cooperation with Russia over very important security issues. Would point to, first of all, the removal and the disposal of the entire declared chemical weapons arsenal of Syria, which took place in 2014. And of course, we've had the important agreement on Iran, which for the first time, Mr. Obama, in his term of presidency, has something nice to say about Mr. Putin. So it is possible, but I think in conclusion, I am concerned that to me, Russia is more unpredictable and potentially more dangerous today than I think at any time in the last 30 years. A colleague over at the American Enterprise Institute, Leon Aaron, wrote a good article, or a provocative article, in the Los Angeles Times about a year ago, arguing that Vladimir Putin is the most unconstrained and heavily armed leader in world history. It's an interesting thought. You know, Stalin was pretty unconstrained, didn't have the weapons that are available now. Brezhnev, Khrushchev were more politically constrained in their domestic political context, et cetera. But I think, I would say the domestic political climate today in Russia may not be so conducive to progress on the issues that we've been talking about, but it is essential that we continue to talk about them. I also think it is essential that we don't take the approach of cutting off our nose to spite our face. You know, to discontinue a lot of the activities that were done in the context of the NATO Russia Council, to me, that smacks of cutting off your nose to spite your face, because we don't do this as a favor to the Russians. We do many of these cooperative things because we think that they help to alleviate the security dilemma and the security challenges that we face. So I've gone on too long. Let me thank you and turn it over to the next speaker, Steve.
Okay, good. Well, first, let me thank Sharon and CSIS both for inviting me to participate today, but also for including me in the workshops that took place in October and June. Because I would very much agree with what Andy said, is these sorts of conversations, these sorts of channels are very important, particularly at a time of more difficult relations between the West and Russia. I'm going to focus my talk on two things that came out of the June workshop: the need to take steps to avoid accident miscalculation, and also the utility of a discussion about nuclear doctrine. But I first might make a comment on just something that Sharon alluded to, which there were a lot of steps, a lot of things that you could do with regards to non-strategic nuclear weapons that particularly in the second session we didn't talk about. And it wasn't that we were unaware of those, it was just that they didn't seem to be issues that had much prospect. And just to briefly go through them, the most direct way to deal with non-strategic nuclear weapons would be actually to negotiate numerical limits on them. And of course, you would have to resolve a series of verification issues and things like that. You know, one idea I think that did come up is, in June, was this difference, you know, does it make sense now to have this distinction between strategic and non-strategic? You know, maybe you want to move to a situation where you limit all nuclear weapons, period. But beyond limits, there were a range of confidence and security building measures, again, that we didn't get into much detail on. One would be transparency, an agreement that the United States, NATO, and Russia would exchange data on numbers, types, and locations of weapons. And then as Sharon suggested in her opening remarks, well, maybe you could start with the unilateral reductions that Washington and Moscow announced in 1991 and 1992, because exchanging data on historical things might be easier than exchanging data on current numbers. Other ideas out there that the United States and Russia might announce a no-increase commitment. Both countries are modernizing their non-strategic arsenals, but it doesn't look like either side sees a need to increase them. Another idea is this idea of demating. In the case of the U.S. non-strategic arsenal, where you're only talking about one weapon, the B-61 bomb, those are not mated, those are not mounted on aircraft. And as we understand, in most, perhaps all cases on the Russian side, the non-strategic warheads are physically separate from the delivery system. Could the sides agree that as a practice, they would basically commit to continue that, keep the warheads and the delivery systems separate? And other ideas out there that have been discussed in the past: relocation, consolidation of weapons. So there's actually this fairly rich menu of ideas on confidence-building measures in addition to numerical limits. Now, there was, I think, a very good reason we did not spend a lot of time in October, or particularly in June, on these questions, because the Russian government has made clear since the New START Treaty entered into force in 2011 that it has little interest in talking about limits or confidence-building measures on non-strategic weapons. The official Russian government position now is that it would be prepared to have a conversation about these systems only once the United States had withdrawn all of its non-strategic nuclear weapons, and that's believed to be about 200 nuclear bombs in Europe, but had withdrawn those weapons from Europe to the United States and then destroyed the infrastructure for them in Europe, a position that I don't think is acceptable to NATO. We've also, I think that there's also turns out to be a little bit more reluctance on the NATO side when you talk about these questions. There has been a conversation ongoing for a couple of years within NATO on the types of confidence and security building measures that NATO might be prepared to talk about. That's been a closed conversation, but when we on the outside get a glimpse at it, it seems like the list of measures seems to be shrinking. And I'll just throw out one example of how difficult sometimes this can be. I took part about 2.5 years ago in a track 1.5 conversation where we had a mix of government officials and non-government experts from NATO countries. On the Russian side, it was just non-governmental experts. But one of the ideas that came out of this workshop is that perhaps an easy confidence-building measure on non-strategic nuclear weapons would be to say, okay, you can go to places where we used to store non-strategic weapons and verify that they're not there, because you're not giving away much information on current stockpiles. And this seemed to be an idea that this group felt was actually had some interest. And some of our German participants said, well, let's do a next conference in Germany. And Germany, of course, during the Cold War, when it was divided in East-West Germany, had been hosting both American non-strategic nuclear weapons in Western Germany and Soviet non-strategic nuclear weapons in Eastern Germany. And the idea was we can have this workshop take place in Germany and have a field trip and go and visit a former American site and a former Soviet site. And that idea had a lot of interest until it ran into the wall posed by American, NATO, and German security procedures. And we've yet to have those visits. So I think the workshop, particularly in June, we said, let's focus on more modest and more achievable steps with regards to non-strategic weapons, but also in the current circumstances, particularly with the deterioration in relations that's taken place largely since the Russian seizure of Crimea and Russian military action in eastern Ukraine, in what can we do and what is necessary. And so one area that we focused on, and this really moved beyond non-strategic weapons, was an urgent need to avoid accidents and miscalculations. And since early 2014, since the time of Russia's illegal seizure of Crimea, you have had a significant increase in the number of instances where you have NATO and Russian military forces, aircraft, ships, operating in close proximity to one another. So, for example, NATO now reports that in 2014 and the first part of this year, they are intercepting Russian military aircraft near NATO airspace at a rate 3 to 4 times the rate of 2013. The European Leadership Network came out with a report last year where it talked about 40 potentially dangerous interactions between NATO and Russian military units. And I think there were 2 cases in that report that were particularly alarming, where it was reported that Russian intelligence aircraft operating in international airspace, but operating in or near civilian air lanes, were operating with their transponders off, which meant that they were invisible to civilian air traffic control. And the potentially most disturbing case was last year where an SAS airliner south of Sweden had to take evasive action at the last moment to avoid a mid-air collision. Now, I would argue that neither side wants these kinds of accidents and miscalculations, and there in fact is a significant body that they can build on to try to avoid this. In the U.S. case, you have the 1972 Incidents at Sea Agreement, and you have the 1989 Dangerous Military Activities Agreement. And a number of NATO countries have parallel agreements with the Russians, but not all. And there's no blanket agreement that covers sort of all NATO forces and Russian forces. But agreements like Incidents at Sea and Dangerous Military Activities were designed to set rules for how military forces would operate. So, for example, in the Incidents at Sea agreement, once that was internalized, American Navy pilots were told that if you're intercepting a Russian aircraft near an American aircraft carrier, this is the specific angle that you approach at so that you do not seem hostile. The agreement would set things like, say, aircraft cannot overfly ships of the other side at an altitude lower than such and such. In the Dangerous Military Activities Agreement, which primarily focused on interactions between American and Soviet forces along the inter-German border, units at the tactical level said, if something's going on the other side and it's of concern and it's ambiguous, here's a radio channel you can call and say, what's going on? And the whole point of these agreements was to reduce risky situations, reduce ambiguous situations, and provide immediate means for the forces involved to clarify it so that you do not have an accident. And so I think we came out of the discussion in June with the idea that it would make sense, despite the ratcheting down in NATO-Russian military, NATO-Russia contacts, to have a NATO-Russia discussion that would look at these agreements update them, and then try to negotiate an agreement that would cover all NATO and Russian military forces. And again, we thought this kind of agreement, presumably since neither side wants an accidental conflict, would be in the interest both in NATO capitals and Moscow. Now, the one question that came up was, well, would the Russians really want this? I mean, if one of the things that the Russians are trying to do with this uptick in Russian military activity over the last year is to intimidate, create concern in the West, do they want to take the edge off these sorts of activities? But I think it's important to ask, go back to that case with the SAS airliner last year. What would have happened had the pilot not taken evasive action and there had, in fact, been a mid-air collision between an airliner and a Russian military aircraft with its transponder off? Think about the impact on Russia's image, but also think about the pressure that then publics would be applying on NATO military forces to be much more aggressive in terms of intercepting and escorting Russian military aircraft. So this is something neither side should want. Another idea that came up is that although there have been lots of tensions, you do have a couple of documents in Europe that have worked. The Vienna document on confidence and security building measures and the Open Skies Treaty. So the question is, could you take those documents and improve them? The Vienna document on confidence and security building measures, for example, requires that you notify exercises over a certain level. Could you lower that level so that, in fact, NATO and Russia are notifying to each other more of their exercises, so you avoid a situation where a snap exercise runs the risk of being misinterpreted by the other side? Likewise, with open skies, could you negotiate an increase in the number of flights? Because, again, these can contribute to confidence. And then one suggestion that came up was, well, could you begin to expand coverage of some of those data exchanges to include things like non-strategic nuclear weapons? I think the group recognizes that would be difficult, but there might be some interest on the Russian side if the United States was prepared to talk about things like providing data on missile defense systems, which are now being deployed to Europe. So those were some of the ideas that we talked about to reduce the risk of accident and miscalculation. We also thought that there was quite a bit of utility to begin discussing nuclear doctrine. And looking at the two sides, I mean, NATO has made clear that it remains a nuclear alliance. But if you look at the role that non-strategic nuclear weapons play in alliance defense policy, it's significantly less. It's significantly reduced from the time of the Cold War. And you see this in the fact that the number of American nuclear weapons in Europe over the last 25 years has been reduced significantly. We used to have a number of different types of nuclear weapons. Now it's only the B-61 gravity bomb. And NATO Cold War practices, and God be familiar, this is a quick reaction alert, where at times during the Cold War you actually had NATO aircraft with nuclear weapons on them prepared to launch very, very quickly. And I think I saw a NATO document a few years back that it said it would take a number of weeks to recover that status. So there has been a ratcheting down on the side. And I think it's true when NATO thinks about non-strategic nuclear weapons in Europe, it's primarily in terms of deterrence, but also assurance. They are a symbol of American commitment to defend Europe, and I think a symbol that has become more important in the last couple of years in places like the Baltic region and Poland and Central Europe because of concerns about Russia. And if used, I mean, I think NATO doctrine looks at nuclear weapons and says if a nuclear weapon or a non-strategic nuclear weapon would be used, it would be used less for the military effect than for the political effect. The political signal that a nuclear weapon would send by being used would be that this conflict has reached the point where it's in danger of spinning out of control, perhaps escalating to strategic nuclear weapons, and it's time to stop. Now, if you look at the Russian doctrine, at least the unclassified Russian doctrine, it doesn't seem to be so problematic. Russia has now said, both in its 2010 and its 2015 doctrines, that it would use nuclear weapons in two cases. One, if nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction were used against Russia or a Russian ally, or two, if there was a conventional military assault on Russia where the existence of the Russian state was at stake. And I look at those and I say, well, that doesn't sound that much different from NATO's policy of flexible response in the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. But there are some questions. First of all, we don't know what classified Russian doctrine says. There is this notion of the Russians talk about de-escalation, the idea of escalating the use of nuclear weapons to stop a conflict, which again sounds like it might be similar to flexible response, except there's not a lot of clarity about the doctrine. For example, what is the threshold for nuclear use that the doctrine sees? How low is that? some descriptions seem to suggest that de-escalation envisages use of nuclear weapons as much for their military impact as for a political signal. And there was just a bit of general confusion. I mean, it was interesting, I think, to the American participants in the June discussion that virtually all of the Russian participants said de-escalation is not a part of Russian doctrine, which seems to contradict what we've been reading a lot about what Russians have been writing about nuclear doctrine for the last 15 years. So I think one thing we came out of this discussion was it would be useful to begin to talk about doctrines in a way to have a better understanding of how the sides view these. It was also really very clear from the June discussion that when Russia looks at non-strategic nuclear weapons, it is looking at these weapons as an offset for what it regards as NATO and American advantages in precision-guided conventional weapons and in conventional and general purpose forces. Left unsaid, and my own belief is that when the Russians look at non-strategic nuclear weapons, and it may be a bit politically incorrect to say this after President Putin's visit to Beijing yesterday, but I think actually a big factor in this is the Chinese factor, where I believe the Russians do not understand, do not see how they could cope with a conflict with China, certainly not at the conventional level, and non-strategic weapons play a role in that. But again, what came out of this discussion was it would be very helpful to have a better understanding of nuclear doctrine on both sides, and maybe some sense that having that conversation would be easier than talking about specific confidence-building measures or limits on non-strategic weapons. Finally, we chatted a little bit about the question of the role of nuclear messaging, which Andy has already referred to. Nuclear issues have become more prominent publicly in the last year because Vladimir Putin talks about nuclear weapons so much. In March, there was a documentary put out on Russian state television about the Crimea crisis in February, March of 2014. And at one point, Mr. Putin says, I was prepared to put our forces on nuclear alert. And I think the reaction most of the West was, what? Because if you look at that crisis, how it played out, there was no evidence that NATO was prepared to take military action, no NATO nuclear alerts. I mean, NATO began to take steps really only at the end of March, well after the crisis had reached its key point and Russia had already annexed Crimea. And so there are a lot of questions where we don't have good answers. Why does Mr. Putin talk about nuclear weapons so much? And I've come up with 3 or 4 ideas. A couple ideas are benign, a couple less so. I mean, one reason may be is that he likes to think of Russia as a superpower. And if you look at the measures of superpower status today, really the only area that Russia competes is nuclear weapons. Another area is that the Russians, and I think still believe that they have some areas where they lag behind the West and China in terms of conventional forces. So part of the reason to talk about nuclear weapons is to remind the world, look, if we get beat conventionally, we can escalate to nuclear. A third reason may be that he's read his Thomas Schelling and that he sees some value to appearing a little bit crazy, a little bit unpredictable when you talk about nuclear weapons, particularly if it's part of an effort which I think we're seeing now to, in some ways, intimidate the West. But the most worrisome suggestion is that some of his language suggests that he might see nuclear weapons not as instruments of deterrence, but of instruments of coercion, and that would be worrisome. So again, some kind of discussion that would allow us to understand this, I think, would be very useful. So what came out of the June workshop was there are some very important areas for conversation where discussions between NATO and Russian military officials would make a lot of sense, even at a time when NATO-Russia relations are at a fairly low point. But I guess the question is, can NATO and Russia have a productive exchange on these kind of issues in the current political environment?
Okay, well, thank you very much, Sharon. It's really a pleasure to be here, and it was also a pleasure for me to participate in these workshops. Of course, the problem of being last speaker means everybody said everything I wanted to say, so I really have very little to add. But the one thing I do want to emphasize is right up front is I think of all of the things that we did during these workshops, the most important aspect of these workshops was the fact that we held them. And the fact that we engage in a dialogue that at present we don't really have with NATO. The NATO Russia Council process has been suspended until further notice. And there is no dialogue going on between NATO and Russia, and I regret that. Certainly, at the height of the Cold War, we continued to have a dialogue, and not to discuss these things, I think, is a dangerous opportunity for miscalculation. It's interesting to reflect back over the last decade and see how much things have changed. And first of all, in 2003, I was working in the Department of Defense, and I was actually one of the people that were negotiating the Moscow Treaty. And as part of, after we'd finished signing that treaty, I was tasked to go to Geneva for the first consultative group meeting, or as we called it, to have a dialogue with the Russians. And I had bought into the fact that the Cold War was over and that we no longer had an adversary, and we were strategic partners or competitors at worst. So I dutifully, in arranging the room for our meeting, set the two heads of delegation at the heads of the table and the delegations down the sides. And the Russians went crazy. Absolutely said, no, no way, it's got to be across the table. And we wouldn't do it like that, as a collegial kind of a relationship. And then when our head of delegation started talking about the fact that you were no longer an adversary, I still remember the head starting to turn red from that kind of attitude, which clearly indicated the United States was going to treat Russia just like it treated any other country, and there was no longer this same status, so to speak. So then a couple of years later, in 2005, and I assume my post at NATO, it's hard to believe now, but in actual fact, we were seriously talking about NATO becoming a member, Russia becoming a member of NATO, and being a part of a membership action plan. And we'd actually circulated a few drafts and had some discussions. And then in 2006, we had something called the 12-city tour of Russia, in which senior NATO officials were tasked to go out to the 12 major cities in Russia and talk about how wonderful NATO is and how we're no longer in opposition. So I got the short stick, and I got Murmansk. So I dutifully trotted off to Murmansk, above the largest city above the Arctic Circle, but shedding people left and right as we speak. And lo and behold, when I showed up at the university, there was about 150, 200 people there protesting my presence. And I couldn't figure this out. So I walked up to this elderly gentleman who had some ribbons on his blouse, and with my interpreter I said, well, why are you protesting my presence here as a NATO official to talk about the great relationship we have with Russia? And his answer was, because my pension is too low. Now, it took me a while to figure that one out, but what he was essentially saying, and I think was echoed by Steve earlier here, and Andy, is that all the problems internal within Russia is not our fault, it's because of you guys. It's because of what you did to us. And so that, and that kind of continued to resonate, and I think has resonated, and is part of, I think, what we see now and what Putin plays up to and with his audience. I guess he still has an 80% or better approval rating by people in Russia. So, as I said, so I just want to, put that as kind of some interesting anecdotes. I was also acting assistant secretary in August when Russia invaded Georgia, and I just can say it was really, really hard to get all the ambassadors back from their vacation, even with an invasion. That's one of the most sacrosanct things you don't want to touch as an August holiday by our European colleagues. I wanted to speak a little bit about NATO. One of the things that I would ask you to keep in mind is that the NATO alliance, the NATO allies, are continually concerned about and interested in the Russia-U.S. bilateral dialogue. We've made it very clear, and even though I'm no longer a member of the NATO staff, I still sometimes say we, because I still think of myself as trying to reflect that alliance's views on many things. And as Steve indicated, it is true that we've endorsed, and again, in both our strategic concepts of 2010 and other documents and our statements during our summits that we will remain for the foreseeable future in the current situation a nuclear alliance. But more importantly is that political dimension that Steve alluded to, and that is the real desire to burden share, to be a part of that nuclear deterrence posture. And even more important is the consultative aspects of that. That is that the United States will consult if it ever contemplates using nuclear weapons under any situation, and this goes way back to the early 60s. Participation, this political linkage is incredibly important. I can't emphasize that enough. And the physical presence of a U.S. nuclear deterrent assuages any fears that the United States may eventually abandon those that are members of the alliance. Participation, and this reflects in the arms control process as well. The alliance looks to actively participate. In fact, we set up a committee that would provide a forum for the U.S. to keep the alliance informed about bilateral U.S. Russian relations, and particularly in the arms control realm. And their concern is that whatever dialogue goes on between the United States and Russia, it should not lead to the weakening of the transatlantic link in NATO. And it shouldn't, instead, it should be based on the assumption of reciprocity between the allies, not just the United States, the allies and Russia. This inclusion of what I call the European footprint in any of these arms control processes needs to be subject to this consultative process in the alliance. And it's also firmly based on the principle of the indivisibility of security. And in every document that NATO puts out, and especially in its summit statements, we talk about this again and again, about this indivisibility of security. Saying all that, the alliance still goes at great lengths to endorse and support and embrace arms control and the reciprocity aspect of that. Even the most diehard official within any government in the alliance that believes that we should eliminate all nuclear weapons, they talk about it only in the official context of reciprocity and a quid pro quo, that we would not eliminate our nuclear weapons, we would not reduce our nuclear posture, except in a process of discussion and negotiation with Russia. In the last summit, the alliance again stated that they look forward to developing various transparency and confidence-building ideas with the Russian Federation in the context of a NATO Council with the goal of developing detailed proposals and increasing on mutual understanding. They continue to believe that this partnership between NATO and Russia, based on the respect of international law, is of strategic value and continues to aspire to a cooperative, constructive relationship, but one that's reciprocal. The flip side of that is, as they've said in the Wales Summit, is that current conditions do not exist to allow that to continue, and then the alliance decided, in essence, to suspend all discussions within the context of the NATO Russia Council. Now, when I was there, I chaired something called the Nuclear Group, and that Nuclear Group developed a series of confidence and security building measures that were short-term, mid-term, and long-term. Among those included discussions on NATO and Russia, nuclear doctrine. Those discussions were candid and were very open. It was a very constructive dialogue. NATO on its side was pushing to have Russia provide information on their tactical or non-strategic nuclear weapons, which they refused to do, but they were still willing to talk about doctrine and do it in that classified environment. We had 3 of those meetings. We also dealt with safety and security of nuclear weapons, and in that process, each nuclear weapon state, of which there are 4, United Kingdom, France, the United States, and Russia, conducted very specific safety and security exercises at a location in each one of those countries. They were very successful, and they were really eye-openers for the NATO alliance as to how these countries would conduct response to situations where a nuclear weapon might have been stolen, there might have been an accident, or there might have been a detonation of some sort. The follow-on exercise was to be a nuclear weapon or nuclear device in a country that wasn't a nuclear weapon state. And Russia decided they asked that it be in one of the states that had the dual capable aircraft mission. None of those states came forward to have this exercise. Another country did, and the Russians refused to participate. And this was all happening in 2010 and 2011. And at that point, there was no longer any discussion on transparency and confidence building. So I'm back, I guess, and I'll just close up because I think it's good to have some discussions. But again, as far as NATO is concerned, they're very interested and keen on having a continuing dialogue on these confidence and security building measures. That's not happening. And given the continued animosity and difficulties and challenges of the various accusations and allegations, I really don't see that happening in the very near future. How are we doing? Well, I guess I can finish up by telling a story that I think aptly captures our challenges, and that is the story about 2 hunters that go hunting for bear up in Alaska. They get up there and they're dropped off by the pilot in this little airplane, and the pilot says, well, you know what, just to let you know, I can only take back you 2 guys and 1 bear. 3 days later, the pilot flies back, and there's the 2 hunters with 2 bears. And they start arguing, and he says, look, I can't do it. And finally, one of the hunters says, look, I'll give you an extra $1,000 if you'll take all of us, including the 2 bears. He says, well, okay. They load the 2 bears in the plane. The 2 hunters get in the plane takes off. It gets about 5 miles and crashes. And miracle, miracle, both hunters survive. One staggers up, looks around and says, where are we? The other one says, well, I think we're about 2 miles further than we were last year. So we continue to go down that path. And with that, I'll close and take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Guy. Well, we do certainly have a lot of, was it the same pilot both years?
Different pilot. Yeah.
I don't think so. We certainly have enough time for questions, and while you are all gathering your thoughts, let me just pick up on a few things. I know the agenda says that listed me as an additional speaker. I'm not going to talk. I've said enough. What I'm going to do is moderate a discussion and take your questions. On the NATO Russia Council, Guy, even if NATO were inclined to resume some of those activities, do you think the Russians would bite?
I don't think so, and part of the reason is that, you know, and surprisingly for an alliance, and at the Wales Summit last year, actually it's exactly a year from last year, there's some very, very strong language that made it quite clear that there was no longer going to be business as usual with the alliance. For example, quote, Russia has breached its commitments as well as violated international law, and that's a very big thing for Europeans, thus breaking the trust at the core of our cooperation. And they lamented the fact that for 2 decades, the NATO has gone to extraordinary lengths to embrace this relationship. As I said, talking seriously about them becoming a member of NATO. And as a result of Crimea, as a result of the activities in eastern Ukraine, but also the things they've done and threatened to do in Georgia and Moldova, and just a whole litany. In fact, if you go on the NATO website, and they've actually listed the 25 years of mythical crimes that NATO has committed against the Russian Federation and responded to that. And it's a long, long list. Everything from NATO promised that we would never deploy forces in Eastern Europe to we violated the nuclear non-proliferation treaty by training pilots to fly the nuclear mission. And it just goes on and on and on. So it's really going to be hard, Sharon, I think, to go back to a relationship. And again, as I said at the very beginning, I'm very disappointed in that in some respects. I think we should have been a little bit more forceful. The alliance should have been a little bit more forceful in trying to re-engage and saying, look, where can we, as Steve Andy's pointed out, where are these areas that we can actually start talking again and start building the trust and confidence? And as I said, that's why at the end of the day, I think this track 2 that we're engaged in is going to pay huge dividends and is really, really important.
No, I think, Sharon, I think that Guy is largely right, but let me try to add just a little ray of optimism. And I went through the early 1990s when I worked at the State Department on arms control issues, and you had the Soviet walkout from both the negotiations on intermediate-range nuclear forces and on strategic arms reductions at the end of 1983. You had a deep freeze in U.S.-Soviet relations throughout 1984, and then in 1985, in early 1985, the Soviets said we want to resume the negotiations. And within 2.5 years, you had the INF Treaty and major progress on START. So I think it's very hard to be optimistic about the current state of U.S. Russian and West Russian relations right now. But we also ought to not ignore the possibility that there may be an opportunity to try to turn things around. Again, I think probably being pessimistic is the more realistic course now. But things can change fairly quickly. That's been demonstrated by relations between Washington and Moscow in the last 30 years.
One other thing, Steve, that you brought up, this question in talking about doctrine. And the Russians are quite interested in talking about new technologies, right? Whether it's precision-guided munitions or other things. And I quite clearly remember a question from one of the participants to the Russians where it was asked, okay, well, how would you feel about a cyber attack? Does a cyber attack constitute an attack on your state? Does it create an existential threat? And the answer was, well, okay, from one Russian, right? Well, that depends on how successful it is, right? So that seems to be a very risky situation for us to be in, and I fully understand that these talks with Russia and with everybody else on cybersecurity and on any kind of limits are difficult. But once you introduce the notion of, well, a nuclear response to a cyber attack, it seems to me we need some kind of forum for at least discussing these issues. And NATO may not be the right place. I mean, I just welcome your thoughts on that.
No, I think one of the things that came out in the discussion was that on the NATO side, my guess is that the alliance is going to have to be prepared to talk about questions other than non-strategic nuclear weapons if it wants to have a dialogue with Russia on non-strategic nuclear weapons. And that would include questions like missile defense. It would include issues like conventional prop global strike. And it might even include issues like conventional forces, because I do believe that at least now, while the Russians are in the process of modernizing their conventional forces, there is a perception, and I think it still reflects the reality, that if you look at NATO forces and Russian forces at the conventional level, NATO still has some significant quantitative and in particular qualitative advantages. So you're going to have that broader discussion. Where cyber fits into that, I don't know. And part of it may well be is I'm not sure yet that either the United States and Russia separately have a fixed enough doctrine on cyber to have that conversation. Now, you could argue maybe it's better to start the conversation before sides get fixed. But for all of the attention that's just talked about here in the cyber world, I'm not sure I understand what American doctrine on cyber is. And I'll give you an example, because I do think that when the U.S. government thinks about cyber, how do you deter cyber attacks? And about 4 or 5 years ago, I was out. Strategic Command does this annual deterrence seminar in August where they talk about a range of deterrence questions. And at one time, they had a very interesting panel on cyber deterrence. And the question I posed, and I'm not sure I felt I received a good answer, was, when I look at deterrence in the strategic nuclear area, I understand what we're talking about, because I can read Hans Christensen's writings and say, how many strategic bombers does the United States have? How many intercontinental ballistic missiles? We periodically exercise them. So it's very clear to the world, what backs up American strategic deterrence in terms of forces and doctrine. If you look at the cyber side, it's still a pretty opaque world. I mean, we don't know, how much does the U.S. military put into cyber, how many people are working on what sorts of capabilities. And so I don't know how deterrence works in that world when you're not communicating to the side. If you conduct a cyber attack, here's what might happen. And we may have to be getting our own thinking a bit in order before we can have a useful conversation with the Russians on that.
Let me just add, at NATO we have a Cyber Center of Excellence in Tallinn, and that was the genesis of that was a cyber attack, massive cyber attack from unknown sources. And as a result, at NATO headquarters, they've created a cyber division, very small, but one that is, again, not wholly endorsed by all the members of the alliance, but is, again, recognizing the many challenges and difficulties, what is an attack, and so on and so forth, and trying to come to grips with it by creating an infrastructure to deal with it and have a forum for discussion on that. And there was talk about having working group like that in the context of the NATO Russia Council, just like we have. I chaired, for example, a theater missile defense subgroup in addition to the nuclear group, and which we had very good cooperation with the Russians up until 2008. So that's, again, they've structured themselves to try to deal with it, but again, there's a long way to go.
Thanks, Sharon. Yeah, Steve put his finger, I think, on the sort of essential question, and you kind of rephrased it. I think, does Russia want to reduce the risk? And when we look at an incident like MH17 and the response to MH17, that certainly doesn't give one great optimism, and it certainly is a massive trust destroyer. But let me offer a little bit, a ray of optimism. And it has to do, I think, with, for us to participate in a track 2, it really is a track 2. I mean, we don't really need to think about necessarily, or I certainly don't, many of the participants don't need to think about whether the U.S. government endorses this or not. The Russian system doesn't work that way. So just the very fact that we are able to hold these discussions and to have the level of representation that we had from the Russian Federation says something that at least some areas in the Russian government are supportive of continuing these types of discussions. Maybe not in the context of a NATO Russia discussion right now, as Guy suggested, but in this context, and it just only emphasizes, I think, the point that Guy was making, that what we are doing is all that much more important.
Thank you. It's time to take questions from you. So we have some roving microphones, and I just ask that you introduce yourself and your affiliation, and I'll try and go in order. Austin, can you come up front? Thanks.
Thanks. Hi, my name is Andrei Sitov. I'm a Russian reporter with TASS, the Russian news agency. And actually, my question is a direct follow-up to what you've just been discussing. First, I think it's an important discussion. Thank you for having it. Second, for me as a journalist, it's hard to even cover this event because I do not understand its practical significance. So I have a group of eminent experts who seem to be agreed that the dialogue is needed. From what I'm hearing from all of you, you are for an official dialogue on confidence building, on trust building, all of that. Like Andrew just said, on the Russian side, it's probably sanctioned in some way, even on track 2. But what about the American side? So you are all for it, so what does it mean? You also seem to be all agreed that the West and the U.S. are not willing at this point to restart the dialogue. That's my question. What does it mean? What does this panel mean? What does your opinion matter for Washington?
Let me try briefly, and then I'll let the diplomats take over. Yes, this is track 2, but remember also our sponsor for this dialogue was the U.S. government. And there was definitely interest in the U.S. government. We had some government speakers that did not participate formally in the dialogue, but did attend, gave luncheon and dinner notes. I know anecdotally, not on an official level, that there is great interest in what was said. I don't know that the U.S. government has plans to follow up on this. That's beyond my ken. Yeah, it's not quite. I don't know if I would say it was totally track 2, sort of track 1.5. I think both sides. I think Steve put it quite well. Both sides have a big interest in reducing some of the risks that are currently not entirely nuclear, right? But the risks of these of inadvertent escalation. And so to the extent that this may contribute to helping mitigate some misunderstandings, I think there's great interest in it. Other panelists?
It's a great question, Andre. But just on the value of the event today, okay, this event is being streamed live on the internet, and I believe that C-SPAN is also broadcasting the event. So I think there is a value simply in the role of public education, that we are talking about this. Reasonably serious people, knowledgeable people, and we think that there is a problem, and that maybe this can possibly have some influence, outside of the building in a multitude of ways.
I just add 2 points briefly. Anytime I've had a conversation with somebody in the U.S. government about a track 2 effort that I've been involved in, the U.S. government supports these side of things. They think that these contacts are useful. They keep a dialogue going. Sometimes they actually produce ideas which then can work their ways into official channels. I guess the second point I would make, and at least this would be my view, is that in the aftermath of Russia's military seizure of Crimea and Russian military action in eastern Ukraine, it was appropriate for NATO and Russia, for the NATO to ratchet down the NATO-Russia relationship. I mean, there have to be political consequences to egregious bad behavior. But I think probably the feeling of most of the American participants in the workshop is that it might make sense for NATO now to relax that and open up the way for a NATO-Russia military-to-military dialogue, particularly on the issue of how do you avoid accident and miscalculation when you have an increased tempo of NATO and Russian military forces operating in close proximity. So we'd say, let's open the door to that. Now, having said that, I also think in my own mind, I'm not yet sure whether the Russians would then say, yes, we want to have that dialogue. But I would argue that it would be worthwhile for NATO to try to do that because, neither side should have an interest in a conflict that begins by a miscalculation or accident.
Thank you. I saw a question first, this young woman here, and then...
Thank you. Nisu Gören, University of Maryland. I follow the story from the Allies' perspective, particularly from Turkey. So my question had to do with a follow-up on the idea that NATO is not prepared to reaffirm its commitment to the three no's. Considering the significant divide among the allies, especially when it comes to the reluctance to host the tactical nuclear weapons versus the ones who are eager to receive the modernization of the warheads and the next generation of dual-capable aircraft. How much longer can NATO actually continue pursuing its policy of avoiding talking about the three no's? Are we actually going to see new countries, particularly in Eastern Europe, who will take over the mission?
Great question. Guy?
I don't think. That's right. That's a good question. It's complicated. I think, well, clearly right now, NATO is relooking at its nuclear policy. And they're going through somewhat of a bureaucratic process to see if anything needs to be changed. But the fact of the matter is, NATO conducts nuclear exercises, but they don't announce them. It's not public. If you look at the handout, and I commend that to you, there are several really good papers in there, including mine, but and the report. But I have a slide in there, for example, that shows that if a nuclear mission for NATO was ever required, that up to 16 different nations would be participating in that forward deployment, again, to send the political message of the solidarity of the alliance. And part of the burden-sharing ongoing process that we have today is all the other nations are looking for ways in which they can participate in some way other than holding the annual Nuclear Policy Symposium, as how they can actively participate. Now, given the current circumstances, there's been a lot of talk about the possibility of forward deployment. There's, as far as I've seen, at least in my discussions with people at NATO, and no one is talking about moving nuclear weapons and having them being permanently stationed. But there is, discussion about, well, what more can we do, and how can we, back to the messaging part of that, a huge part of that messaging is this solidarity by doing these exercises with as many nations as possible actively participating. Now, with the three no's, the one thing people forget about the three no's is it also says at the end of that sentence, based on the current policy situation. The policy situation has changed. And so you do get some people talking, well, the situation has changed, particularly some of our Eastern European allies. They say, well, those three no's are no longer relevant, and we need to re-examine it. But from an overarching alliance standpoint, I don't see any changes, certainly a movement of those, and it wouldn't, from a technical standpoint, have any relevance anyway, to be frank. But again, that's not to say that we aren't continuing our exercises. Arms Control Association does a good job of announcing those that we try to keep secret. Okay, yeah.
If I could just go, the three no's, just a little bit of history. The three no's were NATO said back in 1997 when it, in the Founding Act, and this was incorporated in the NATO Russia Founding Act, but it was NATO policy that they said as a result of enlargement, there was no intention, no plan, no requirement to deploy nuclear weapons on the territory of new NATO members. And I agree with everything that Guy just said about the importance of NATO consultations on nuclear questions, the importance of burden sharing, but I would also argue, and I think I missed this part of the discussion in October because I would have said we probably could reaffirm the NATO three no's. I mean, it seems to me, and there have been some suggestions in the last 5 or 6 months from some quarters here in Washington, not in the government, but outside, about maybe a response to Russian bad behavior in Ukraine should be to move American nuclear weapons to a place like Poland. I personally think that would be unwise on 3 counts. First of all, deploying those weapons from their current locations to a place like Poland makes them actually much more vulnerable to Russian preemptive strike in a crisis. The Iskander missile, if it's deployed in Kaliningrad, can cover about 2/3 of Polish territory. Second, I don't mind in the current sense and circumstances being a little bit provocative towards Russia, but putting American nuclear weapons in a place like Poland would be really, really provocative. Think 1962 and the Cuban Missile Crisis. The third reason is I think that if the United States were to go to NATO and say, we want to move some of our B-61 bombs and the delivery aircraft from their current locations to Poland, my guess is you would have a large number of allies, perhaps majority allies, saying, are you out of your mind? So an idea that makes weapons more vulnerable, really ticks off the Russians, and causes dissonance, disruption with the alliance doesn't strike me as a particularly smart policy.
Pfeiffer's 3 no's.
Yeah. So this is where I take it. I mean, I think, while it makes sense in parallel with the 3 no's, NATO also at the time said that, again, in the current and foreseeable security circumstances, there would be no requirement for permanent stationing of substantial conventional combat forces on the territory of new allies. Now, I think that there's a discussion to be had about that question, but it seems to me that the 3 no's would still apply, because I don't think it buys you anything in military terms, and it buys you, lots of problems if you start changing that.
Well, and as I said, from a technical standpoint, we saw no need to do that. I mean, take away all those others, but, will it give us added benefit and make it us more capable? And the answer is no.
4 no's. We had a question right back there. Thank you. Ed Ift.
Edward F., Georgetown University. Sharon raised the question of what do the Russians think about the suspension of all these working groups. I was at a conference several months ago at which Ambassador Kislyak spoke, and he was lamenting the suspension of these groups, and he said that we, Russia, would like to resume them, but we're not going to beg. I think that's your answer.
Other questions here and then there.
Thank you. Maciej Lemka, Georgetown University as well. So Pew Research Center released an interesting results of its poll conducted in several NATO countries, Ukraine and Russia. And one of the things that the poll showed is a very sharp divide within NATO on the Article 5 commitments. And what do you think, how does that affect further progress on limiting non-strategic nuclear weapons in Europe?
Yeah, I saw that poll. My guess is I could go back to the 1970s and 1980s and find very similar polls. I'm not sure how much weight to put in them. I think NATO governments very seriously understand what Article 5 is about, and I think that they understand that supporting each other in Article 5 is essential to maintaining the alliance. Now, and I see that as a totally separate question from the issue of non-strategic nuclear weapons.
Hi. Gary Sargent. I'm a retired Army officer by trade. I work for a small consulting company. My question is because we're talking non-strategic nuclear weapons, they're hard to find. So I wanted hopefully somebody could expand a little bit on the remote sensing piece you talked about. And then the second thing would be is at the operational level, who has launch sort of capability, if that's even something you guys can share or understand or believe from Russia? In terms of authorization, what level? Is it down to tactical division, Army commanders in terms of executing? Because I'm always worried about mistakes, because the Army and everybody makes mistakes all the time.
Yeah, it's a very long, if there was a scenario where we would actually contemplate the use of nuclear weapons, then there's a process that we go through. It's actually, Interesting. Is that what you're talking about?
No, I'm talking on the Russian side.
Oh, the Russian side.
Yeah. If you guys know that or.
I don't know that.
On the issue of remote sensing, you know, the challenge that you face with non-strategic, well, in arms control, right? The closer you get to the warheads, the more intrusive the monitoring is going to be. And so you can talk about non-intrusive monitoring and then remote monitoring. We did talk about, I'm trying to remember the technology, that muon radiography. We're at a little bit of a loss. I'm trying to think we're all political scientists. I'm not sure here up on this panel, but
My problem is I consult for MIT so that's why I'm asking the question.
oh, you need to ask them that question. No, but these are you know, our national labs have been involved in this kind of technology development for decades, but the issue there is, you know, if you were to sign an agreement in 10 or 15 years, you would already need to be starting that development today. So there are long lead times for some of the stuff. I know I'm not giving a very good specific answer, but there are, I think Nancy Jo Nicholas described some of them in detail in the paper that's available on our website. But the point is, you need to start that collaboration now. And the earlier, if you do that collaboration with the Russians, then, you know, you all have buy-in into particular techniques and approaches.
There was one point at the October workshop where we had somebody from one of the U.S. labs give a briefing on this muon radiography. And they showed a slide that said that with this technology, 1 m away from the thing, you could actually tell, is that a nuclear warhead or not? And I remember raising my hand and said, please tell me that's 1 mile. And they said, no, that's 1 meter. So we're still talking about limited technology, but it gets to Sharon's point, and I think pretty much everybody agreed on the American and the Russian side is that there would be value in having a dialogue right now between American, Russians, and others that said, how do you develop verification technologies, looking to getting questions that go beyond current treaties? You know, how would you, for example, if you wanted to monitor a limit on nuclear weapons in storage, what would be the sorts of technology that you would need? And then actually putting time and effort into developing them now. So if political circumstances reached the point where you could get that treaty, the treaty wasn't held up because you didn't have the verification techniques. And to the extent that you could develop some of those technologies and techniques in a cooperative manner, where it was not coming from an American lab or a Russian lab, but it was coming out of a joint effort, that technology actually, in the end, might be more acceptable to both sides. I think the State Department in December of last year announced an effort to try to promote development of further technologies in the area of verification and to encourage, you know, universities to make contributions. What I don't have a good fix on is how much funding went to that thing, but they are beginning to think about how do you develop technologies so that you have things on the shelf and the absence of a particular monitoring technology does not prevent a treaty from going into force.
Thank you. Richard Fieldhouse, former Senate Armed Services Committee staffer and now doing consulting work. I wanted to sort of provide a context and a question and you've all explained under the current circumstances with Ukrainian crisis left unresolved and the risks that ensue from that and the fact that so many of the official dialogues have come down. I think there's wide agreement that this is not a time when there's going to be any likely progress on this issue. And maybe if there's some political resolution of the Ukraine crisis, that would change dramatically. But there is an avenue that I want to explore, and I know some of you have thought about this. The New START agreement, a new treaty, will come to an end at some point. And there may be an interest, both in the United States and Russia, in either continuing or doing something additional. So there are restraints on both sides and their strategic nuclear forces. I would point out that from the Senate standpoint, when the Senate considered the New START treaty, and in many communication since. It's been a clear and official part of the Senate perspective that any future arms control of Russia would have to include non-strategic nuclear weapons. And that's actually written into the resolution of advice and consent to ratification, and it required the administration to actually make an official approach to Russia to begin a dialogue on these non-strategic nuclear weapons. They did. The Russians weren't interested, et cetera. But the question is, can you foresee a time when that might be the avenue, if you will, to having serious official dialogue on the issue?
No, I try to be optimistic about these things. I do believe that even though you now have a difficult situation between Washington and Moscow, that at some point, maybe it's 2018 or 2019, that the Russians will have an interest in having a dialogue about what happens with New START. The New START Treaty entered into force in 2011. By its terms, it expires in February of 2021, although the sides do have the ability to extend the treaty by mutual agreement by up to 5 years. And while the Russians have shown little readiness in the last 4 years to go beyond New START, I do think that they would want to have a continuation of some kind of cap on American strategic forces and a certain amount of transparency, particularly if you're talking about the time frame of 2020, 2021, which is when U.S. strategic modernization programs with the Ohio-class ballistic missile submarine replacement, with a new strategic bomber, possibly with a new intercontinental ballistic missile, as those are coming online, that would be a time where I think the Russians would want to have some kind of cap. The question then becomes, would an American administration and would American negotiators then be able to use that Russian interest as leverage to say, okay, but now we have to go beyond strategic and we have to talk about non-strategic. I think that's going to be a judgment they'll have to reach at the time. Whether that gives enough leverage to force the Russians to do something. I personally would like to see the next step in U.S. Russia arms control move beyond limiting just strategic or just deployed strategic and move to a treaty where at least one aspect would be a limit on the total number of nuclear weapons, deployed, non-deployed, strategic, non-strategic, and then with maybe some kind of a subceiling on the deployed strategic warheads. But I think we won't know for a number of years until we actually get into that negotiation where the Russian interest in having some kind of treaty gives us the leverage to get them to broaden the number of systems covered to pick up nuclear weapons beyond strategic.
Andy, did you want to add something?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and my honest answer is maybe. Russia is prone to nonlinear events and development. So kind of extrapolating where we are today in 2015 and assuming that'll be the situation in 2018 or 2020 is risky. I would say that, though, that one key positive step, and this seems obvious, to kind of get to this point where I think we would like to be, is there has to be a resolution of the situation in Ukraine. And that resolution of the Ukraine situation then has to include, I think, a broader discussion about European security. And then if there's progress on that, then I think, this could be more possible. But there has to be some facilitating conditions that happen before that's able to happen.
We had a question up here and then over to there.
I'm Milton Honig, International Center for Terrorism Studies. You mentioned that in your workshops there were some provocative ideas presented in connection with the safety and security of non-strategic weapons. Were the ideas presented by the Americans substantially different from those presented by the Russians in their originality? Could you contrast any of these, or you can mention some of the ideas that were presented?
Sure. Actually, it was our European but that's okay. This was the topic that I assigned to him. And actually, What I meant by provocative was just that at a time when you're even struggling to find venues to talk to Russians, the notion that you could talk to them or have joint exercises or anything else about safety and security of these tactical nuclear weapons was a little counterintuitive. That's why I said it was provocative. The recommendations or the ideas that, and it was Oliver Meyer from the Hessische Stiftung, I forget what you call it, what is it? Friedensforschung? Peace Research Institute.
Good German scholar.
Good German scholar, formerly with Arms Control and Association. These built on things that we've done with the Russians already in terms of exercises, but trying to push a little bit more. So there were 6 items, and you can read about them in the report, but just briefly, joint assessment of the risk. And you know, if anybody has been following the nuclear security summit context, you know that any discussions of, risk assessments are very taboo. We're certainly not going to do that with the Russians now because they're not attending the nuclear security summit in 2016. You could also, as I said, flip that around and talk about site security improvements. You can share best practices. This is how, in a generic sense, you could have exercises focused on accidents or incidents and associated consequence management. You could develop incident response procedures. So for example, you could consider, I'm just going to read from the report, tabletop and joint exercises to develop and test procedures for responding to different crisis scenarios. Some of these things are borrowed from the nuclear security world. You could set up a 1540, the UN Security Council Resolution 5040, joint working group to explore challenges specific to safeguarding non-strategic nuclear weapons from access by non-state actors. You could, and then this is really a holdover to the other areas, initiate a dialogue between NATO and Russia on measures to avoid this unintended escalation of military encounters. So, I wouldn't call these necessarily provocative. The question is, do you have, what's the hook to initiate or resume some of those things that had been done under the NATO Russia Council? Sure, go ahead.
I wanted to add something to the previous question. And maybe let me be a little more frank. I'd be pretty pessimistic, frankly, about having a discussion with the Russians about non-strategic nuclear weapons. I mean, even if the conditions that I talked about happen, the structural situation, the structural security situation that Russia faces, and the asymmetry and the importance of nuclear weapons for Russia, that's not going to go away in 5 years. That's likely only going to increase. And so I think from their perspective, make that discussion perhaps even harder to make progress on. We weren't able to make progress on that in 25 years, really. And in the 1990s, when it was a much more felicitous political environment. So to think that in 5 years, when I think the structure or the core problem, the asymmetry of our sort of the strategic mismatch, I think it's going to be worse. I think it's going to be tougher.
I would just add to that, overwhelmingly, after these 2 dialogues, what I come away with is, and I think, Steve, you said it earlier, you can't, it's very difficult to just put these nuclear issues in a box. Yeah. When we said, look, you need to have a new dialogue, or when these participants said, you need a new dialogue on European security, how do you get there? Who do you include? You need to talk about issues or concerns from both sides. And I don't say this to be a Pollyanna, okay? I spent most of my career in the U.S. government, not outside, actually doing negotiations in arms control. But there are some Russian concerns or issues that are not going to go away. I mean, we can't simply keep deploying missile defenses and pretend like it doesn't matter or that there aren't issues of concern with that. We have our own security interest to consider, obviously. But, so the real question is, can you, if you can't get anywhere on non-strategic nuclear weapons in a purely nuclear avenue, are there other things, or is there a broader discussion where you might make progress on that? And this is not simply the, gee, we'll trade TAC nukes for ballistic missile defenses. We're obviously, nobody's recommending that, but you have to at least have those discussions, not in the press, but face-to-face.
And again, there's an antecedent to that. If you go back to 1985, when the United States and the Soviet Union resumed nuclear arms control discussions, it was done in the nuclear and space talks, where you had a group on strategic nuclear forces, a group on intermediate-range nuclear forces, and a group on defense and space. Because the Russian, or the Soviets at the time, said, in order to talk about reducing strategic forces, we also have to have a dialogue that covers our concerns about things like American missile defenses. Now, in the end, the defense and space talks did not produce an agreement, but the context of that overall discussion then created a framework where you could get the INF Treaty and the the START I Treaty.
Yeah, I remember, in 2011, one of the big hopes for the Obama administration was to reach a modus vivendi with the Russians about missile defense. And that failed. And I think it failed primarily because we weren't really ready to talk about missile defense in the broader context of strategic stability, where you bring in the role of strategic offensive weapons, non-strategic nuclear weapons, precision-guided munitions, missile defense, space weapons. And it was my hope in 2013, when the Obama administration was trying again to engage in this, that at least, that to me, success in those efforts in the spring and the summer of 2013 would have, to me, I would have said, if we'd agreed to a framework for discussions about strategic stability, for a broader framework. Because if we're not able to do that, because I don't think that we can make progress simply on looking at non-strategic nuclear weapons off to the side.
So I saw one last hand up.
Hi, I'm Meg Kelly. I'm here at CSIS. This was briefly mentioned, but I was hoping you could speak a little bit further specifically about China as a factor in Russia's willingness to move forward with positive dialogue or possibly arms reduction.
Yeah, well, no, the formal Russian position, as I think it's been articulated now by Foreign Minister Lavrov, is that the next stage in nuclear arms limitation talks should not be U.S. Russia. It should include at least Britain, France, and China. I agree in principle at some point the dialogue has to be a multilateral one, but I would argue, and here I'm using Hans's numbers here so he can correct me if I get them wrong, but I think if you look at the total American and Russian nuclear arsenals, each of those countries is about 4,500 total nuclear weapons, including strategic and non-strategic. France and China would be close to the next largest country at about 300 weapons apiece. So I would argue that ultimately you have to get into a multilateral dialogue, but it does seem to me that there's significant room for one more bilateral U.S.-Russian negotiation. I mean, if Washington and Moscow agreed to cut their total nuclear arsenals in half, they'd still be 6 to 7 times larger than the nearest third country. But at least so far, what the Russians are saying publicly is that no, the next negotiation has to bring in third countries. Now, there might be a half step that you could do, because I don't believe that the Chinese are going to be prepared to say, yes, we're going to make a commitment in a treaty not to go above 300 while you're still at 2,000 or 3,000. But could you ask the Chinese, the British, and the French, for example, to undertake a unilateral political commitment in which they would just say, as a matter of our policy, we will not increase the number of our nuclear weapons as long as the United States and Russia are reducing?
Meg, it's a great question. In my discussions with Russians over the years, there's no question that the Russians are concerned about what China is doing and could possibly do in modernization and possibly expansion of their nuclear weapons capability. Over the years, they've talked They've been frustrated, I think, at least in discussions with me, about what they see as a lack of transparency in Chinese programs. Now, the China-Russia relationship at some level is a black box for us. So you can't answer the questions with any certainty, but I think it was significant that back in, I think, 2006 or 2007, the Russians approached the Bush administration with the notion of trying to multilateralize the INF Treaty. And I think the Bush administration's response was, well, sure, try, good luck. I don't think, that would be great, but it was not really met with certainly any interest. And I think it was the concerns principally about China that was motivating the Russians at the time.
That raises an interesting question, which is that, sometimes, especially when you're at NATO, you forget that the rest of the world also has issues and interests, and that was brought home to me when I was had a visit by the Japanese ambassador in Brussels, who had heard about NATO's discussion with the Russians about various ideas concerning non-strategic nuclear weapons, which is, well, why don't you just take them all that are west of the Urals and move them east of the Urals? And that prompted the visit, saying, well, gee, that's going to upset the whole balance that we have in this part of the world, and that really isn't such a good idea. I mean, we should be talking about really elimination, although one of the ideas floating around was to take them and move them so they would be less of a so-called threat to NATO. So there is a concern there that you need to take into account, is that in fact a broader strategic outlook needs to be addressed when you're dealing with this very small issue of non-strategic nuclear weapons, or not so small.
Panelists, do you have any last comments? All right. So thank you all for your time and attention today to this important topic. I hope that even though or the fact that everyone showed up on a Friday before Labor Day means we're ready to come back from our strategic holiday and work on these important issues. Let me just thank very briefly our external relations staff, my staff, Yukari Sakaguchi, Jack Disher, and Austin Baker for helping put this all together. And finally, please help me thank our panelists.